Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through ancient Greece and its timeless stories. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away, and if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Picture yourself walking through the hills of ancient Corinth on a warm evening 2,500 years ago. The Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of olive trees and the distant sound of waves against rocky shores. You're heading toward the palace of King Sisyphus, though you don't yet know that this particular king will become famous for something quite extraordinary and quite exhausting. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. Sisyphus wasn't always rolling a boulder up a mountain for eternity. That part comes later. Right now in this story, he's still very much alive, ruling over the prosperous city of Corinth. And he's got a problem that most kings would envy. He's too clever for his own good. You see, Sisyphus has figured out something that mortals aren't supposed to know. He's learned how to cheat death itself. But let's start at the beginning, shall we? Imagine you're a citizen of Corinth during Sisyphus's reign. You wake up each morning to the sound of merchants setting up their stalls in the agora, the marketplace. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the salty air from the harbor. Ships arrive daily bringing pottery from Athens, silk from distant lands, and stories from travelers who've crossed the known world. Your King Sisyphus is known for three things. First, he's incredibly smart, so smart that people whisper he might outwit the gods themselves. Second, he's built Corinth into one of the most prosperous cities in all of Greece. And third, well, he's not entirely honest, but in a way that somehow benefits everyone around him, so nobody complains too loudly. You might see Sisyphus in the morning walking through the city streets with a measured pace. He doesn't rush like other kings might. Instead, he observes everything. The way merchants arrange their goods, how the ships are loaded at the harbor, which roads the travelers prefer. He's always thinking, always planning. His mind works like a spider, spinning an invisible web, connecting details that others miss. One particular morning, something unusual happens. You're buying olives from your favorite vendor when you notice a man in a dark cloak walking through the marketplace. He's not shopping or talking to anyone. He's just watching. There's something about him that makes people step aside without thinking about it. The way shadows seem to follow him, the way conversations quiet down as he passes. This man is Thanatos, Death himself, though you don't know it yet. He's come to Corinth on official business. Someone is supposed to die today, and Thanatos has come to collect that someone. The problem is, the someone he's come for is King Sisyphus. But Sisyphus, being Sisyphus, has been expecting this visit for quite some time. Remember that he's incredibly clever. He's figured out patterns that others miss. He's noticed things about timing, about the way certain events unfold, and he's had a suspicion that his number might be up soon. So when Thanatos appears at the palace that evening, Sisyphus greets him like an old friend. "Welcome, welcome," he says, offering the finest wine and the most comfortable chair. "You must be tired from your journey. Please sit and rest." Now, Thanatos doesn't usually get invited to sit down and chat. Most people either run away screaming or simply accept their fate. This friendly reception is unexpected, and Thanatos, despite being death incarnate, is curious. "I suppose you know why I'm here," says Thanatos, settling into the offered chair. "The wine is excellent," he has to admit. "Oh, absolutely," replies Sisyphus. "And I have to say, I'm impressed by your work. The precision, the timing, the way you manage to keep everything balanced. It must be incredibly complex coordinating all those transitions." Thanatos finds himself nodding. It is complex work, and rarely does anyone appreciate the skill involved. He takes another sip of wine and continues the conversation. "But tell me," Sisyphus continues, "how exactly does it work? The mechanism. I mean, I've always been fascinated by clever mechanisms. Take these chains for instance. He gestures to a set of elaborate silver chains hanging on the wall. They're supposed to be unbreakable, according to the smith who made them. But I've always wondered, how would you even test such a claim? And here's where Sisyphus's reputation for cleverness really shows itself. Because somehow, through a combination of curiosity, flattery, and excellent wine, he convinces Thanatos to try on the chains just to test them. You understand? For professional interest. The moment those chains click shut around Thanatos's wrists, everything changes. Death itself is now trapped in Sisyphus's palace. This is awkward, admits Thanatos. For you, maybe, says Sisyphus with a smile. For me, it's rather convenient. And so begins the strangest period in the history of both Corinth and the world. With death chained up in the palace, nobody can die. Not in Corinth, not anywhere. Old people keep getting older, instead of passing peacefully away. Warriors in distant battles receive fatal wounds, but somehow keep fighting. People begin to notice that something fundamental has shifted in the natural order. For Sisyphus, this is perfect. He's achieved what every mortal secretly dreams of. He's beaten death. He spends his days ruling Corinth, enjoying long dinners with his wife Merope, watching the sunset from his palace balcony. He's won the ultimate game, but winning isn't always as satisfying as you might expect. After a few weeks, Sisyphus notices that Thanatos, despite being chained up, doesn't seem particularly upset about the situation. In fact, he seems almost amused. "Enjoying your victory?" asks Thanatos one evening. "Thoroughly," replies Sisyphus, though there's something in Thanatos's tone that makes him slightly uneasy. Good. I hope you savor it, because you know eventually my colleagues are going to notice that I haven't been reporting back, and when they do, Thanatos trails off with a knowing smile. It's then that Sisyphus realizes he might have won the battle, but not necessarily the war. The gods, as it turns out, don't appreciate having their fundamental systems disrupted, even by very clever kings. Still, for now, in this moment, Sisyphus has achieved the impossible. He's sitting in his palace, very much alive, having outmaneuvered death itself. The evening light filters through the windows, painting everything in soft gold. Somewhere in the distance, ships are returning to harbor, their sails catching the last breeze of the day, and in his comfortable chair, Thanatos waits patiently, knowing that all victories are temporary, and that the story of Sisyphus has only just begun. What do you think happens when the other gods notice that death has gone missing? And more importantly, what would you do if you could cheat death? Would the victory feel as sweet as you imagine? Or would you start to wonder, like Sisyphus might be wondering right now, whether some games are too dangerous to win? You're probably wondering what happens next to Sisyphus and his unusual house guest. Well, let's find out together, shall we? Picture yourself 3 weeks after Thanatos was chained up in the palace of Corinth. The initial excitement of the impossible has settled into something stranger, a world where the most natural thing of all has simply stopped happening. You wake up each morning in this new reality where death has taken an unexpected vacation. At first, nobody really notices. After all, death isn't something that happens to everyone every day, but slowly, gradually, people begin to realize that something fundamental has shifted. The old man who runs the pottery shop, who's been coughing badly for months, is still coughing, but he's not getting worse. The woman who fell from her roof last week should have died from her injuries, but she's walking around with broken bones that should have been fatal, complaining about the inconvenience. You might think this sounds wonderful. No more grief, no more loss. But as the days pass, you start to notice that immortality isn't quite the gift it seems to be. Let's follow a day in this death-free world. You wake up in your small house near the Corinth marketplace. Outside your window you can hear the usual morning sounds, merchants setting up their stalls, children playing in the streets, the distant sound of waves against the harbor. Everything seems normal. But when you go to buy bread from the baker, you notice something odd. The baker's grandfather, who's been lying sick in bed for months, is now up and helping in the shop. He moves slowly. His breathing is labored. "How is your grandfather feeling?" you ask the baker. The baker glances toward the old man and shrugs. "He should have passed peacefully weeks ago. Now he's stuck. We don't know what to do with him. He's in pain, but he can't find rest." This is the dark side of Sisyphus's victory. Without death, suffering doesn't end. It just continues. The natural rhythm that allows the old to rest and make room for the young has been disrupted. Meanwhile, up in the palace, Sisyphus is having his morning wine with Thanatos, who remains chained, but surprisingly conversational. They've developed an odd routine over these past weeks. Sisyphus brings Thanatos food and drink, and they discuss philosophy, politics, and the mechanics of mortality. "Tell me," says Sisyphus, pouring wine for both of them, "don't you get bored? All that collecting of souls day after day, century after century?" Thanatos considers this question while examining his chains. They're beautifully crafted, he has to admit. "You might be surprised. Each person faces death differently. Some fight, some accept, some try to bargain. It's quite varied work. And now," asks Sisyphus, "now I'm having wine with a very clever king, and watching the world slowly realize that perhaps death isn't such a terrible thing after all." Indeed. News is beginning to reach Corinth from other parts of Greece. A messenger arrives with reports that make everyone uneasy. In Athens, an old woman has been trapped under a collapsed building for a week, unable to die despite her injuries. In Sparta, warriors are fighting battles where everyone receives fatal wounds, but nobody falls. The battlefields are full of men who should be dead, but continue fighting with sword cuts that would normally be lethal. The natural order of things is unraveling, and it's causing problems that nobody anticipated. But the real trouble begins when the news reaches Mount Olympus. The gods, you see, have been busy with their own affairs and haven't immediately noticed that their carefully organized system has ground to a halt. But eventually Hades, the god of the underworld, realizes that no new souls have arrived in quite some time. At first, he assumes it's just a slow period. Perhaps there's been an unusual stretch of peace and good health in the mortal world. But when days turn into weeks with no arrivals, he begins to investigate. And when he discovers that Thanatos is missing, well, that's when things get interesting. Back in Corinth, you're going about your daily routine when you notice something that makes your blood run cold. The sky, which has been bright and clear, suddenly darkens, not with clouds but with something else. The very air seems to thicken with the presence of divine anger. Sisyphus, still in his palace, feels it too. He's sitting across from Thanatos, sharing what has become their customary afternoon wine, when the temperature in the room drops noticeably. "I believe," says Thanatos mildly, "that would be Ares. Hades sent him to investigate." Sisyphus tries to keep his voice steady. "The god of war. He's particularly upset about the recent complications on battlefields." And indeed, the palace doors burst open without anyone touching them. Into the room strides Ares, god of war, and he is not happy. He's tall, broad-shouldered, wearing armor that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes burn with the fury of 1,000 battles. "What?" he demands. "Have you done?" Sisyphus, to his credit, doesn't immediately panic. He stands up slowly, offers a respectful bow, and gestures to a chair. "Lord Ares, welcome to my palace. Would you care for some wine?" Ares looks at the chained Thanatos, then at Sisyphus, then back at Thanatos. "Are you seriously offering me wine while you're holding death prisoner?" "Well," says Sisyphus reasonably, "it seemed like the polite thing to do." For a moment Ares is so astounded by the sheer audacity of this response that he doesn't know what to say. Here's a mortal king who has somehow captured death itself, thrown the entire cosmic order into chaos, and is offering refreshments like it's a social visit. But Ares recovers quickly. With a gesture that seems casual but contains the force of divine power, He shatters the chains binding Thanatos. The silver links scatter across the floor, like drops of water. "Thank you," says Thanatos, stretching his arms. Those were getting rather uncomfortable. Sisyphus watches his victory dissolve before his eyes, but even now, even facing the wrath of gods, his mind is working because Sisyphus, you see, is never quite finished with his schemes. "Before you take me," he says to Thanatos, "might I ask one small favor?" Both gods look at him with surprise. Most mortals, when facing death after such an audacious trick, tend to beg for mercy or try to run. They don't ask for favors. "What kind of favor?" asks Thanatos, curious despite himself. And this is where Sisyphus springs his next trap, because even though he's lost this round, he's already thinking 3 moves ahead. As evening falls over Corinth and the natural order begins to reassert itself across the world, people everywhere feel a subtle shift. The old potter's grandfather finally closes his eyes and finds peace. The wounded warriors on distant battlefields receive the rest they've been denied. The woman trapped under the collapsed building in Athens is finally released from her suffering. Death has returned to the world, as natural and necessary as breathing. And yet somehow you get the feeling that Sisyphus's story with death is not quite finished. After all, a man clever enough to chain death itself probably has more than one trick up his sleeve. What do you think that favor might be? And how do you imagine the gods will react when they realize that Sisyphus, even in defeat, might still be playing a game they don't fully understand? Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who remain calm even when they appear to be losing. You remember that favor Sisyphus asked for, just as Thanatos was about to take him? Well, that favor is about to reshape everything you thought you knew about the king of Corinth. Picture yourself in the palace courtyard the next morning. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of olive trees and the distant salt of the sea. You might expect to find the palace in mourning, draped in black cloth, with servants weeping for their fallen king. Instead, you find something much more puzzling. The palace is completely ordinary. No mourning clothes, no funeral preparations, no grief-stricken queen. In fact, Queen Merope is going about her daily routine, as if nothing unusual has happened at all. She's discussing menu plans with the cook, reviewing trade agreements with merchants, and generally behaving like a woman whose husband is very much alive. But here's the thing. Sisyphus isn't alive. Thanatos did indeed take him. To understand what's happening, we need to go back to that favor Sisyphus requested when facing death. Most people ask for more time or mercy, or a chance to say goodbye. Sisyphus asked for something much more specific, and as it turns out, much more clever. "Before I come with you," he said to Thanatos, "I'd like to make sure my affairs are in order. You understand, I'm a king, after all. There are responsibilities." Thanatos, who had recently spent several weeks chained up thanks to Sisyphus's tricks, was understandably cautious. "What exactly do you mean by affairs?" "Nothing dramatic," Sisyphus assured him. "Just a conversation with my wife, instructions about my funeral rites, the proper ceremonies. You know how important these things are." And indeed, funeral rites were enormously important in ancient Greece. Without the proper ceremonies, a soul couldn't find peace in the underworld. Even the gods respected this tradition. So, Thanatos agreed to let Sisyphus speak with his wife before departing. What happened next was the conversation between Sisyphus and Queen Merope. But it wasn't the conversation you might expect between a husband and wife facing eternal separation. "Listen carefully," Sisyphus told her, speaking quietly so that Thanatos couldn't hear. "When I die, and I will die very shortly, you must not perform the funeral rites." Merope looked confused. "What do you mean? No funeral pyre, no offerings to the gods, no coins on my eyes for the ferryman, nothing. Let everyone think you're simply forgetful about these matters, but without proper rites, your soul will be trapped." "Exactly," said Sisyphus with that smile that usually meant he was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "Trust me on this." So when Thanatos led Sisyphus away to the underworld, Merope did exactly as her husband had instructed. She went about her daily routine. She made no funeral preparations. She acted as if her husband had simply gone on a business trip and would return when his work was finished. Now, let's follow what happened to Sisyphus in the realm of the dead. The underworld, you should know, is not the fiery place of torture that some stories describe. It's more like a vast grey bureaucracy, an endless series of rooms and corridors where souls are processed, judged, and assigned to their eternal accommodations. Sisyphus arrives and is directed, like all newly deceased souls, to the banks of the river Styx. Here he's supposed to pay Charon the ferryman 2 coins for passage across the river. These coins should have been placed on his eyes during his funeral rites. But of course there were no funeral rites. So, Sisyphus has no coins. "I'm sorry," he tells Charon, "but there seems to have been an oversight. My wife was supposed to provide the fare, but apparently she forgot." Charon, who has been ferrying souls across the Styx for thousands of years, has seen every possible situation. "Without the fare, I can't take you across," Charon explains. "Those are the rules." Of course, says Sisyphus. "I completely understand. Rules are rules. But surely there's someone I can speak to about this, some sort of administrative review process." And so, Sisyphus finds himself in the underworld, equivalent of a customer service complaint. He's shuffled from one minor official to another, each one trying to figure out what to do with a soul who technically can't proceed to judgment because the proper formalities weren't observed. Eventually, the matter reaches Hades himself. The god of the underworld is sitting on his throne reviewing the day's paperwork when an aide approaches nervously. "My lord," says the aide, "we have an unusual situation. There's a soul here who can't be processed because his funeral rites were never performed." Hades looks up from his paperwork. "Never performed. That's odd. What does the soul have to say about this?" He claims his wife simply forgot, my lord. He seems quite upset about it. Now, Hades is not easily fooled. He's been ruling the underworld for eons, and he's seen every trick mortals might try. When Sisyphus is brought before the throne, he presents his case with perfect sincerity. He expresses shock and dismay that his beloved wife could have been so negligent. He worries about what this says about their marriage. He frets about the scandal this will cause back in Corinth. "This is deeply troubling," he tells Hades. "My poor Merope must be beside herself with grief. That's probably why she forgot the rites. She's not thinking clearly." Hades studies this unusual mortal. There's something about Sisyphus that seems familiar, though he can't quite place it. "And what would you suggest we do about this situation?" "Well," says Sisyphus thoughtfully, "I suppose someone should go back to Corinth and remind my wife about her duties, make sure the proper ceremonies are performed. But who could do such a thing? You're suggesting..." "Oh, I couldn't possibly suggest anything to a god," Sisyphus says quickly. "But if someone were to temporarily return me to life just long enough to straighten out this administrative error, I would be deeply grateful." And here's where Hades makes the mistake that Sisyphus has been counting on. Faced with an unprecedented bureaucratic problem, and presented with what seems like a reasonable solution, the god of the underworld grants Sisyphus temporary leave to return to life and sort out his funeral arrangements. 3 days, Hades declares. "You have 3 days to ensure the proper rites are performed. Then you return here immediately." "Of course, my lord, 3 days will be more than sufficient." And so Sisyphus finds himself back in the world of the living, supposedly for 3 days only, supposedly just to arrange his own funeral. You can probably guess how seriously he takes these limitations. When he walks through the palace doors that evening, Queen Merope greets him with a smile that doesn't quite hide her nervousness. "How did it go?" she asks. "Perfectly," says Sisyphus. "Though I suspect we may have some explaining to do in a few days." As the sun sets over Corinth, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sisyphus stands on his palace balcony, very much alive in a world where he should be very much dead. The Mediterranean breeze carries the familiar sounds of his city, merchants closing their shops, children being called in for dinner. He's done the impossible again. He's not just cheated death. He's convinced death to politely escort him back to life. But as he watches the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Sisyphus might be wondering if perhaps he's gotten a little too clever for his own good. After all, the gods have a long memory, and they don't appreciate being made to look foolish. What do you think happens when those 3 days are up? And what would you do if you found yourself with a temporary reprieve from death itself? Would you honor the agreement, or would you be tempted to see just how far you could push your luck? Those 3 days Hades granted Sisyphus, well, they came and went about as you might expect from the king who chained up death itself. Picture yourself walking through Corinth 6 months after Sisyphus was supposed to return to the underworld. The morning market is bustling with its usual activity. Merchants are hawking their wares and children are playing in the streets. And there, examining some particularly fine pottery at one of the stalls, is King Sisyphus, very much alive, very much enjoying his extended vacation from death. You see, when those 3 days expired, Sisyphus made a remarkable discovery. He realized that no one was coming to collect him. Apparently the underworld operates on something like an honor system when it comes to temporary resurrections. They simply expected him to return when promised. This was, as you might imagine, a serious miscalculation on their part. Sisyphus spent those months doing exactly what he loved most, ruling his city, enjoying life, and feeling tremendously pleased with himself for outsmarting the gods. Not once, not twice, but 3 times now. He chained death, convinced Hades to let him return to life, and then simply stayed. But divine patience, while considerable, is not infinite. And eventually, the gods noticed that their temporary resurrection had become decidedly permanent. The second time they came for Sisyphus, they didn't send Thanatos. They didn't bother with due process or bureaucratic procedures. This time, they sent Hermes, the messenger god, with very specific instructions. Retrieve Sisyphus immediately by any means necessary and deliver him to the underworld where he belongs. Hermes appeared in the palace throne room on a Tuesday morning while Sisyphus was reviewing trade agreements. There was no dramatic entrance, no thunderclaps or supernatural effects. One moment the room was empty except for the king, and the next moment there was a young man in traveller's clothes standing beside the throne. "Sisyphus," said Hermes pleasantly. "Yeah, late." Sisyphus looked up from his scrolls. "Late for what?" "Your appointment with eternity. You were supposed to return to the underworld 6 months ago." "Ah, all that," said Sisyphus. "Yes, I've been meaning to get back to that. Just been terribly busy with royal duties, you understand. Perhaps next week." Hermes smiled, but it wasn't a particularly warm smile. "I'm afraid next week won't work for anyone involved. We're going now." And this time there was no room for negotiation. Hermes simply touched Sisyphus on the shoulder, and suddenly the king found himself standing in the throne room of Hades, facing a god who was considerably less patient than he had been during their first meeting. "Sisyphus," Hades said, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "we need to have a serious conversation. The throne room of the underworld is not a place designed for comfort. The walls are made of black stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air is cool and still, carrying no scent of the living world above. When Hades speaks, his words seem to hang in the air longer than they should. You chained my colleague Thanatos, disrupting the natural order for weeks. You tricked me into granting you temporary resurrection, and then you simply ignored your obligation to return. This level of creativity cannot continue." Sisyphus, even facing the full displeasure of the god of death, maintained his composure. "I understand your frustration, my lord. Perhaps we could work out some sort of arrangement." "No," said Hades firmly. "No more arrangements. No more negotiations. No more tricks. You wanted to avoid death so badly. Fine, you'll get exactly what you asked for." And this is where Sisyphus learned that sometimes getting exactly what you want is the worst possible outcome. Hades gestured, and suddenly Sisyphus found himself in a place unlike anywhere in the underworld he'd seen before. It was a mountainside, rocky and barren, stretching endlessly upward into a grey sky. At his feet lay a boulder, not enormous, but certainly large enough to be challenging to move. The stone was perfectly round, worn smooth by countless eons of wind and weather. "This is your new home," announced Hades. "And this is your new job. You will push this boulder to the top of the mountain. When you reach the summit, you may rest." Sisyphus looked at the stone, then at the mountain, then back at Hades. "That doesn't sound too terrible, actually. A bit of exercise might be good for me." "Oh, there's one more detail," said Hades with a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "The boulder is enchanted. Every time you near the summit, it will roll back down to the bottom, and you'll have to start again." For the first time in his very long and very clever life, Sisyphus was completely speechless. "Forever," added Hades, just to make sure the point was clear. "You wanted to avoid death. Congratulations. You'll never die. You'll just push this rock up this mountain for all eternity." And with that, Hades vanished, leaving Sisyphus alone on the mountainside with his boulder and the terrible understanding of what true punishment means. The first day Sisyphus approached the task with his usual confidence. How hard could it be? He was clever, resourceful, experienced in solving impossible problems. He put his shoulder to the stone and began to push. The boulder was heavy, but not impossibly so. The mountain was steep, but he was strong. Step by step, foot by foot, hour by hour, he made progress up the slope. The stone rolled smoothly over the rocky ground. His muscles strained, sweat ran down his face, but he was advancing toward the summit. As the hours passed, Sisyphus found himself thinking about his life, near what he estimated to be evening. Though time seemed different in this place, Sisyphus could see the summit approaching. Just a few more yards, just a little more effort. His legs ached, his back was sore, but victory was within reach. He gave the boulder one final mighty push, and it rolled over the crest of the mountain. For a moment, Sisyphus stood at the summit, breathing hard but triumphant. He'd done it, even in eternal punishment. He'd found a way to succeed. He was still cleverer than the gods had given him credit for. Then the boulder began to roll down the other side of the mountain. At first he thought he could catch it. He ran after the stone, reaching out to grab it, to stop its descent. But the boulder moved faster and faster, bouncing and tumbling down the rocky slope, completely beyond his control. Sisyphus watched his day's work disappear in a matter of minutes. The stone rolled all the way to the bottom of the mountain and came to rest in exactly the same spot where he'd started that morning. And then he understood. This wasn't just punishment for his tricks and schemes. This was punishment specifically designed for someone like him. The cruelty wasn't in the physical labor, it was in the hope. Every day he would push the boulder up the mountain. Every day he would make progress, feel the satisfaction of advancing toward his goal. Every day he would reach the summit and experience a moment of triumph. And every day he would have to watch that triumph turn to nothing as the stone rolled back down. As Sisyphus walked slowly back down the mountain to begin again, he realized that the gods had created the perfect punishment for a man who thought he could outwit fate itself. But here's something interesting about Sisyphus. Something that the gods perhaps didn't fully consider when they designed his punishment. He was a man who took pride in persistence, in continuing to try even when the odds were against him. And as he put his shoulder to the boulder for the second time, there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely defeated yet. After all, Eternity is a very long time, and a man clever enough to chain death itself might eventually find something, some small satisfaction, some private victory, even in the most perfect punishment the gods could devise. What do you think Sisyphus is thinking about as he begins that second journey up the mountain, and what would you focus on if you found yourself facing an impossible task that you'd have to repeat forever? Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that nobody else can see. While Sisyphus spends his eternal days pushing a boulder up a mountain, life in Corinth continues without him. But the city he left behind carries the marks of his peculiar rule in ways both obvious and subtle. Imagine you're walking through the streets of Corinth on a typical morning, perhaps a year after Sisyphus disappeared for the final time. The city hasn't stopped functioning. If anything, it runs more smoothly now, but there's something in the air, or a quality that makes Corinth different from other Greek cities. You start your day at the agora, the marketplace that forms the heart of the city. The merchants here have a particular reputation throughout Greece. They're known for being incredibly clever in their negotiations, for finding solutions to problems that stump traders from other cities, and for having an almost supernatural ability to turn disadvantage into profit. Take Marcus, the pottery merchant. He's explaining to a customer from Athens why his vases, which have a small crack running through them, are actually more valuable than perfect pottery. You see, Marcus says, running his finger along the crack. This line shows the clay's journey through the fire. It's proof that the pot has been tested and found strong. A pot without marks hasn't been truly tested yet. The customer from Athens looks skeptical, but somehow by the end of the conversation, he's paying extra for the cracked pottery and thanking Marcus for the education. This is vintage Corinthian salesmanship, the ability to reframe any flaw as a feature, any problem as an opportunity. It's a skill the merchants learned from watching their king for years. Sisyphus had a gift for making people see situations from entirely new angles, and that gift became part of the city's culture. You continue through the market and notice another distinctly Corinthian trait, the way people approach problems. When the baker's oven breaks down, instead of simply calling for a repair, he rigs up a system using mirrors and sunlight to continue baking bread. When a ship arrives with cargo too heavy for the standard cranes, the dock workers devise a pulley system using the ship's own masts. These aren't necessarily better solutions than the conventional approaches. Sometimes they're actually more complicated, but they're creative solutions born from a culture that learned to think around obstacles rather than through them. In the palace, Queen Merope has taken over the day-to-day rule of Corinth. She's proven to be an excellent ruler in her own right, though her approach is considerably more straightforward than her husband's was. When she negotiates trade agreements, for instance, she actually means what she says in the contracts. This has been something of an adjustment for Corinth's trading partners, who had grown accustomed to Sisyphus's more flexible interpretation of written agreements. Several merchants from other cities have been pleasantly surprised to discover that when Queen Merope promises to deliver 100 amphoras of olive oil, she actually delivers 100 amphoras of olive oil, not 97, with a complicated explanation about how 3 are equivalent to 100 when you consider the superior quality. But not all of Sisyphus's influence has faded. The city's children, for instance, are raised on stories of their former king's adventures. But these aren't typical heroic tales. Instead, they're stories about cleverness, about finding unexpected solutions, about the importance of thinking 3 steps ahead. If you visit the school where young Corinthians learn their letters and numbers, you might hear the teacher telling the story of how Sisyphus convinced a rival king to trade his best horses for a herd of mules. He did this by demonstrating that mules, being part 2 donkey, were obviously more intelligent than horses and therefore more valuable. The children love these stories, not because they promote dishonesty, but because they celebrate intelligence and creativity. They learn that there's often more than one way to solve a problem, and that the most obvious solution isn't always the best one. This cultural emphasis on cleverness has practical benefits. Corinthian engineers are renowned throughout Greece for their innovative construction techniques. The city's harbour, which Sisyphus expanded during his reign, uses a system of redirected currents that keeps the water deep enough for large ships without constant dredging, a solution that baffled engineers from other cities until they studied it carefully. The Corinthian military, too, shows signs of Sisyphus's influence. Rather than relying purely on strength and bravery, Corinthian soldiers are trained to think tactically. They're taught to use terrain to their advantage, to find their opponent's weaknesses, and to win battles through strategy rather than simple force. A visiting Spartan general once commented with grudging respect that fighting Corinthians was like playing chess with an opponent who kept changing the rules, not by cheating exactly but by finding interpretations of the rules that no one else had considered. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of post-Sisyphus Corinth is how the people deal with authority. Having been ruled by a king who regularly outwitted gods, Corinthians have developed a healthy skepticism about anyone who claims to have all the answers. When a traveling philosopher arrives in the city, claiming to possess ultimate wisdom about the nature of reality, the Corinthians listen politely and then ask detailed questions that gradually reveal the gaps in his knowledge. They don't do this to be cruel. They're genuinely curious about ideas, but they've learned not to accept any claim without examining it carefully. This intellectual independence has made Corinth a city that attracts thinkers and innovators from across the Mediterranean. Scholars know that if they can present their ideas successfully in Corinth, they can present them anywhere, because Corinthian audiences ask the best questions. The city's temples, too, reflect Sisyphus's influence. While other Greek cities might build temples to impress the gods with their grandeur, Corinthian temples are designed to be clever. The Temple of Apollo, for instance, is built so that the morning sun shines directly on the statue of the god, making it appear to glow with divine light. The Temple of Aphrodite uses acoustics so skillfully that a whispered prayer at one end can be heard clearly at the altar, giving worshippers the impression that the goddess is listening personally to their requests. These aren't attempts to deceive the gods. Greeks were too religious for that. Instead, they're expressions of creativity and worship, ways of making the religious experience more meaningful and memorable. As evening falls over Corinth, you might find yourself in one of the city's taverns. The topics are the same as in any Greek city: politics, trade, family, gossip. But there's a particular quality to how Corinthians discuss these things. When someone presents a problem, the first response isn't sympathy or advice, it's questions. Have you considered approaching it from the other direction? What if the problem isn't actually what you think it is? What would happen if you did the opposite of what everyone expects? This isn't cold intellectualism. Corinthians care deeply about their friends and neighbors, but they've learned from their former king that the best way to help someone is often to help them think differently about their situation. A young merchant worried about competition from a rival trader might leave a Corinthian tavern with a completely new understanding of his business, not because someone gave him advice, but because the right questions helped him see opportunities he'd been missing. As you walk home through the quiet streets, past houses where families are settling in for the night, you might reflect on what it means to live in a city shaped by someone like Sisyphus. It's not that everyone in Corinth is a trickster or a schemer. Most people are honest, hard-working, and straightforward in their dealings, but they've all been touched by the idea that intelligence and creativity are virtues worth cultivating. They've learned that problems often have multiple solutions, that authority should be questioned respectfully but persistently, and that the ability to think differently is one of humanity's greatest gifts. In a way, Sisyphus went waves achieved a kind of immortality after all, not through cheating death, but through the lasting influence he had on the people he ruled. Every time a Corinthian merchant finds a creative solution to a business problem, every time a Corinthian engineer designs an innovative building, every time a Corinthian citizen asks a penetrating question that gets to the heart of an issue, something of Sisyphus lives on. Perhaps that's a better kind of eternal life than he realized. Not endless personal existence, but the continuation of ideas and values that make the world a more interesting place. What kind of lasting influence do you think you'd want to have on your community? And what would it mean to you to know that your way of thinking about problems had become part of how an entire city approached the challenges of daily life? The story of Sisyphus isn't just about one clever king and his boulder, it's about something much larger. The delicate balance of power between mortals and gods, and what happens when someone refuses to accept their place in that balance. Picture yourself in the great council chamber of Mount Olympus. Several days after Sisyphus has been set to his eternal task, the gods are having one of their regular meetings discussing the affairs of mortals and the management of the cosmos. But today, the conversation keeps returning to the case of the Corinthian king. Zeus, the king of the gods, sits on his throne with a thoughtful expression. Around him, his fellow deities debate the implications of what they've just witnessed. Because Sisyphus, you see, has raised questions that go far beyond simple crime and punishment. The problem, says Athena, goddess of wisdom, isn't just that he chained Thanatos or tricked Hades. The problem is that he succeeded. For months, he actually managed to disrupt the fundamental order of existence. Apollo, god of music and prophecy, nods in agreement. Mortals in other cities are already telling stories about Sisyphus. Some of them sound almost admiring. This is the real issue the gods are grappling with. It's not just about punishing one individual for his crimes. It's about maintaining the larger system that keeps the universe functioning. If mortals start believing they can successfully challenge divine authority, what happens to the cosmic order? Hades, still somewhat embarrassed about being outwitted by a mortal, speaks up. The punishment I've devised should serve as a deterrent. Every human who hears the story will understand that cleverness alone isn't enough to defeat the gods. But will they? Asks Hermes. Sisyphus didn't fail because he wasn't clever enough. He failed because we eventually decided to use overwhelming force to stop him. That's not the same thing. And indeed, this distinction is crucial. The gods didn't defeat Sisyphus in a battle of wits. They didn't outsmart him or catch him in his own trap. They simply used their divine power to override his mortal cleverness. This sends a very different message than they might have intended. To understand why this matters, let's consider how Greek society actually worked. The relationship between mortals and gods wasn't like the relationship between slaves and masters. It was more like the relationship between citizens and government. Complex, sometimes adversarial, but governed by certain understood rules. Mortals were expected to honor the gods, perform proper rituals, and accept their fate. In return, the gods were expected to be reasonably fair, to reward virtue, and to maintain cosmic order. When either side violated these expectations, problems arose. Sisyphus had violated his side of the bargain in spectacular fashion. But his violations revealed something uncomfortable about the god's side of the equation. He'd succeeded in his schemes, not through any supernatural power. Meningolis propibiloctus, careful observation of how the divine system actually worked and exploitation of its weaknesses. When he chained Thanatos, he did so by appealing to the god of death's professional pride and curiosity. When he tricked Hades into letting him return to life, he exploited the bureaucratic nature of the underworld and the gods' respect for proper funeral rites. These weren't magical solutions, they were social engineering on a cosmic scale. Back in the mortal world, philosophers and politicians are beginning to discuss the implications. In Athens, a young philosopher named Democritus is developing ideas about the nature of reality that owe something to Sisyphus's example. If a mortal can understand divine systems well enough to manipulate them, what does that say about the nature of those systems? In Sparta, military strategists are studying Sisyphus's methods. How did he manage to identify weaknesses in what seemed like perfect systems? How did he maintain his composure when facing divine wrath? These are skills that might have applications in purely mortal conflicts. The story is spreading throughout the Greek world, but it's evolving as it spreads. Some versions emphasize Sisyphus' hubris and his eventual punishment. serving as a warning about the dangers of challenging the gods. Other versions focus on his cleverness and persistence, making him almost a heroic figure. In the version told in democratic Athens, Sisyphus becomes a symbol of intellectual freedom, a man who refused to accept that any authority, even divine authority, was beyond questioning. Athenian storytellers emphasize his careful reasoning, his systematic approach to problems, and his willingness to face the consequences of his actions. In more conservative Sparta, the story is told differently. Here, Sisyphus represents the dangers of excessive individualism. Spartan versions of the tale emphasize how his selfish desire to avoid death disrupted the natural order and caused suffering for others. The moral is about the importance of accepting one's role in the larger community. But perhaps the most interesting versions of the story are the ones told in smaller cities throughout Greece. Places like Corinth itself, where people live under the direct rule of kings and tyrants. In these versions, Sisyphus becomes something more complex, a cautionary tale about the limits of even the cleverest resistance to power. These storytellers don't portray Sisyphus as either a hero or a villain. Instead, they present him as a brilliant man who understood something important about the nature of power, that all systems, no matter how vast or seemingly perfect, contain weaknesses that can be exploited by someone who observes carefully enough. But they also emphasize the ultimate limitation of this approach. Cleverness can exploit weaknesses in a system, but it can't change the fundamental distribution of power. Sisyphus could manipulate the god's bureaucracy, but he couldn't make himself a god. He could delay his fate, but he couldn't escape it entirely. This interpretation of the story resonates with people who live under political systems they can't directly challenge. They understand the appeal of finding ways to work around authority, but they also understand the importance of recognizing when such efforts have limits. Back on Mount Olympus, the gods are reaching similar conclusions. The case of Sisyphus has forced them to think more carefully about how they exercise their authority. They realize that appearing foolish or incompetent is almost as dangerous as appearing weak. We need to be more careful, Zeus concludes, not because mortals pose a real threat to us, but because our authority depends partly on their respect. If they lose respect for our competence, they might start testing boundaries we don't want tested. This leads to what you might call reforms in the divine government. The gods begin paying more attention to the systematic vulnerabilities that Sisyphus exploited. Procedures are tightened, responsibilities are clarified, and checks are put in place to prevent future bureaucratic manipulation. But they also make a more subtle change. They begin to emphasize different virtues in their interactions with mortals. Instead of demanding only obedience and reverence, they start rewarding intelligence and innovation, as long as these qualities are directed toward constructive rather than subversive ends. The hero Odysseus, for instance, becomes increasingly popular with the gods during this period. Like Sisyphus, Odysseus is known for his cleverness and his ability to find creative solutions to impossible problems. But unlike Sisyphus, Odysseus uses these abilities in service of goals the gods approve of: getting home to his family, defending his kingdom, maintaining social order. This shift represents a kind of compromise. The gods acknowledge that intelligence and creativity are admirable qualities that shouldn't be suppressed, but they also make clear that these qualities should be used responsibly within the bounds of cosmic order. As years pass, the story of Sisyphus becomes a reference point for discussions about power, resistance, and the limits of both. When a tyrant becomes too oppressive, people might say he's forcing his subjects to become like Sisyphus, meaning that he's pushing them toward desperate and ultimately self-destructive acts of resistance. When a rebel or revolutionary begins to overestimate their chances of success, their friends might warn them not to roll the boulder, a phrase that comes to mean pursuing a futile struggle that will ultimately destroy you. But the story also provides a vocabulary for discussing legitimate resistance to authority. When someone points out flaws in a system or finds creative ways to work around unjust rules, they might be praised for their Sisyphean insight. the ability to see through the apparent permanence of power structures to the vulnerabilities beneath. In this way, Sisyphus becomes more than just a character in a cautionary tale. He becomes a symbol of the eternal tension between authority and intelligence, between power and wisdom, between accepting the world as it is and imagining how it might be different. And perhaps that's why his story continues to resonate thousands of years later. We all live within systems of power that sometimes seem overwhelming and permanent. We all face moments when we must decide whether to accept limitations or test them. We all wonder whether cleverness and persistence can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The story of Sisyphus suggests that the answer is both yes and no. Yes. Intelligence and creativity can accomplish remarkable things, can expose weaknesses in even the most powerful systems, can achieve victories that seem impossible. But no, these victories may not be permanent, and the cost of achieving them may ultimately outweigh their benefits. What do you think about this balance? When is it worth challenging authority, even when the odds are against you? And when is it wiser to accept limitations and work within existing systems? Perhaps the real wisdom lies not in choosing one approach or the other, but in understanding when each is appropriate. While Sisyphus pushes his eternal boulder, let's take a moment to explore the vast, complex realm where his punishment takes place. Because the underworld, you see, is much more than just a place where dead people go. It's an entire civilization with its own culture, politics, and daily routines. Picture yourself walking through the administrative districts of Hades, not the fiery torment you might expect, but something that looks remarkably like the government quarter of a large city. There are buildings made of smooth black stone, corridors lined with filing cabinets that stretch up beyond sight, and the constant sound of scribes scratching away with their styluses on endless scrolls. The underworld, you see, has to process every soul that dies anywhere in the world. That's a staggering amount of paperwork. Each soul needs to be evaluated, judged, and assigned to the appropriate section of the afterlife. It's a complex operation that requires careful organization and attention to detail. At the center of this system are the three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. These were mortal kings in life, chosen for their wisdom and fairness to serve as eternal judges. They spend their days and their nights, though time works differently in the underworld, reviewing cases and making decisions about where souls should spend eternity. If you could sit in on one of their daily case review meetings, you'd be surprised by how methodical and thoughtful the process is. Each judge specializes in different types of cases. Minos handles the complex ethical situations, souls whose lives involved difficult moral choices. Rhadamanthus deals with cases involving justice and legal matters. Aeacus manages the more straightforward assessments. Today they're reviewing the file of a merchant from Rhodes who died last week. The man was generally honest in his business dealings, was devoted to his family, and contributed generously to his local temple. But he also made his fortune by selling weapons to both sides during a local conflict, prolonging a war that caused considerable suffering. The intention matters, argues Rhadamanthus. He wasn't trying to prolong the conflict, he was simply conducting business. But the effect was the same, counters Minos. He profited from suffering regardless of his intentions. Aeacus, the most practical of the three, points to a section of the merchant's file. Look at what he did with the profits. He built 3 schools and funded medical care for war orphans. He used money gained from conflict to help heal its consequences. After an hour of discussion, they reach a decision. The merchant will spend time in the middle regions of the underworld, not punished, but not immediately admitted to the peaceful meadows either. He'll have opportunities to work off the moral debt created by his war profiteering through service to other souls. This kind of nuanced judgment is typical of how the underworld actually operates. Despite popular stories about eternal torment, most souls receive punishments that are more like rehabilitation programs. The goal isn't revenge or cruelty, but cosmic balance. Of course, there are exceptions. Some souls receive truly eternal punishments, but these are reserved for the most extreme cases. People who committed crimes so fundamental that they disrupted the basic order of existence. People like, well, Sisyphus. The other famous eternal prisoners include Tantalus, who killed his own son and served him as dinner to the gods, and Ixion, who tried to seduce Zeus's wife. These weren't ordinary crimes. They were violations of the most basic principles that hold reality together. But for every soul suffering eternal punishment, there are thousands working through more temporary consequences for more ordinary failings. The underworld has vast workshops where souls learn skills they never mastered in life. There are counseling centers where people work through the psychological damage they cause to others. There are meditation gardens where souls learn patience and humility. If you walk through these areas, you'll find them surprisingly normal. Former warriors learning to weave, teaching patience and fine motor control. Former tyrants working in teams, learning cooperation. Former misers learning to give freely by helping newly arrived souls adjust to their circumstances. The supervisors of these programs aren't demons or monsters. They're souls who have completed their own rehabilitation and chosen to stay in the underworld to help others. Many of them find this work more meaningful than anything they did during their mortal lives. One of these supervisors is a former pirate captain named Theron, who spent 30 years in the educational workshops learning mathematics, engineering, and architecture. Now he runs a program that teaches newly arrived souls how to build things, not just physical structures, but communities, relationships, and trust. The living think death is the end, Theron explains to a group of recent arrivals. But it's more like graduation. You finish the basic course in existence. Now comes the advanced work. His current class includes a mix of souls from across the ancient world. There's a Celtic chieftain who needs to learn that strength isn't always the solution to problems. An Egyptian scribe who was brilliant with numbers but terrible with people. A Persian merchant who was generous with his family but ruthless with his competitors. They work together on projects that require each of them to contribute their strengths while addressing their weaknesses. The Celtic chieftain learns to listen to others' ideas. The Egyptian scribe learns to explain complex concepts in terms that everyone can understand. The Persian merchant learns to care about the welfare of people he doesn't personally know. It's slow work, but it's not unpleasant. There's satisfaction in learning new skills, in understanding yourself better, in gradually becoming the person you always had the potential to be, but never quite managed during your mortal life. Of course, not everyone in the underworld is in rehabilitation, and the souls who lived virtuous lives go directly to the Elysian fields, peaceful meadows, where they can spend eternity however they choose. Many of them choose to continue learning and growing, but without the structured programs required for souls who have more work to do. And then there are the souls who choose reincarnation. After spending time in the underworld, learning what they need to learn, some souls decide they want to try mortal life again. They drink from the river lull, which erases their memories, and are born again into new lives with fresh opportunities. This system creates an interesting dynamic in the underworld. Some areas feel permanent and settled, inhabited by souls who found their eternal home. Other areas have more of a school-like atmosphere, with a constantly changing population of souls working toward their next destination. The permanent residents often become involved in the administration of the realm. They serve as counselors, teachers, guides, and clerks in the vast bureaucracy that keeps everything running. Many of them find this work deeply fulfilling. They're contributing to something larger than themselves, helping to maintain the cosmic order that governs all existence. But even in this well-organized system, there are ongoing challenges and debates. The judges regularly review policies and procedures, trying to ensure that justice is served fairly and that the rehabilitation programs are actually effective. Recently, they've been discussing the case of Sisyphus and what his punishment reveals about their system. The problem, Minos observes during one of their meetings, is that our system was designed for normal souls with normal crimes. We didn't anticipate someone who would treat divine authority as just another problem to be solved, but that's exactly why his punishment fits, argues Rhadamanthus. He spent his life trying to solve the unsolvable. Now he gets to spend eternity trying to solve the unsolvable. Ikaicus, yeah, always practical, points out a different concern. What happens if his punishment actually works? What if he eventually learns humility and acceptance? Do we release him? It's a fascinating question. The underworld's rehabilitation programs are designed to eventually succeed. But Sisyphus was sentenced to eternal punishment. What happens if eternal punishment conflicts with the goal of helping souls learn and grow? This kind of philosophical puzzle is exactly the sort of thing that keeps the underworld interesting for its permanent residents. They're not just maintaining a cosmic prison, they're participating in an ongoing experiment in justice, growth, and the possibility of redemption. As you walk through the underworld's quiet districts in the evening, or what passes for evening in a realm without a sun, you might encounter souls from across history discussing these deep questions. A Roman philosopher debating ethics with a Chinese sage. A Babylonian astronomer sharing observations with an Egyptian mathematician. A Norse warrior learning about honor from a Polynesian navigator. The underworld, it turns out, is not just a destination for the dead. It's a place where the deepest questions about existence, justice, and human nature are explored by minds freed from the immediate pressures of mortal life. It's a cosmic university where the curriculum includes everything from basic ethics to the fundamental nature of reality itself. And somewhere in this vast, complex realm, Sisyphus continues pushing his boulder up the mountain, perhaps gradually learning lessons that will someday make him a very different person than the clever king who thought he could outwit death itself. What do you think about this vision of the afterlife as a place of continued learning and growth rather than simple reward or punishment? And if you had eternity to learn and develop, what aspects of yourself would you want to work on first? While we've been following Sisyphus and his rocky relationship with mortality, other mortals throughout Greece have been having their own encounters with death, some more successful than others. The story of Alcestis and Admetus shows us a very different approach to cheating death, one based on love rather than cleverness. Picture yourself in the kingdom of Pherae in Thessaly, ruled by King Admetus, a man known throughout Greece for his kindness, justice, and devotion to the gods. Unlike Sisyphus, who seemed to treat the divine powers as problems to be solved, Admetus genuinely respected the gods and tried to live according to their wishes. This respect paid off in an unexpected way when Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and the sun, was temporarily exiled from Mount Olympus as punishment for killing the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. Apollo was sentenced to serve a mortal king for 1 year. He could have chosen any king in Greece, but he chose Admetus. For a full year, the god of music worked as a shepherd, tending Admetus's flocks in the hills outside Pherae. You might imagine this would be a difficult arrangement. A proud god reduced to mortal labor, a mortal king trying to figure out how to treat a divine servant. But it worked out surprisingly well. Admetus treated Apollo with the same kindness he showed all his subjects. He never demanded to know which shepherd was actually a god in disguise. He simply ensured that all his shepherds, divine or otherwise, were well fed, fairly paid, and treated with respect. Apollo, for his part, threw himself into the work with divine enthusiasm. Under his care, Admetus's flocks prospered like never before. The sheep produced the finest wool in Thessaly. The goats gave milk so rich it seemed to contain sunshine. Even the shepherds' huts became places of unexpected beauty, as Apollo couldn't help but bring harmony and grace to everything he touched. When the year of service ended, Apollo was genuinely sorry to leave. He had grown fond of the simple rhythms of pastoral life, and deeply appreciated Admetus's kindness. As a parting gift, he granted the king a remarkable boon. When Admetus's time came to die, he could escape death if he could find someone willing to die in his place. At the time, This seemed like a generous but largely theoretical gift. Admetus was young, healthy, and careful. Death seemed very far away. He thanked Apollo graciously and thought little more about the matter. Years passed peacefully. Admetus married Alcestis, the daughter of King Peleus, in a ceremony that required him to complete an impossible task, yoking a lion and a boar to a chariot. Apollo, still grateful for Admetus's kindness, secretly helped him accomplish this feat. The marriage was happy, blessed with children and prosperity. But eventually, as it must for all mortals, Admetus's time came, not through war or accident, but through a sudden illness that struck him down in what should have been his prime. As he lay dying, the best physicians in Greece unable to help him, he remembered Apollo's gift, someone willing to die in his place. The condition had seemed simple when Apollo first mentioned it, but now Admetus realized how complicated it actually was. How do you ask someone to die for you? How do you even bring up such a topic in conversation? His first thought was his parents. They were old, had lived full lives, and might be willing to make this sacrifice for their son. With great reluctance and embarrassment, he approached his father. "Father," he said, struggling to find the right words, "I have a favor to ask. A very large favor." But when he explained the situation, his father listened thoughtfully, then gently but firmly, he declined. "My son, I love you dearly, but I'm not yet ready to leave this world. I still have things I want to do, places I want to see. I've lived a long life, but I'm not finished living it." His mother gave a similar response. She was sympathetic to his plight, but she too felt that her life wasn't yet complete. There were grandchildren she wanted to watch grow up, gardens she wanted to tend, stories she wanted to finish. Admetus found himself in the strange position of being disappointed in his parents for wanting to continue living. It seemed selfish somehow that people who had already enjoyed long lives wouldn't sacrifice themselves for someone younger, but at the same time, he couldn't really blame them. Who wants to die before their time, even for someone they love? He approached his closest friends, his most loyal servants, even distant relatives. The conversations were awkward beyond description. How do you phrase such a request? "Would you mind dying so I can live?" Sounds terrible. No matter how you put it. Some people made excuses. Others simply refused outright. A few seemed to consider it seriously before ultimately deciding they couldn't go through with it. All of them looked at Admetus a little differently afterward, as if the mere fact of asking had changed their relationship with him. As days passed and his condition worsened, Admetus began to despair. Apollo's gift, which had seemed so generous, was proving useless. Apparently no one loved him enough to die for him, a realization that was almost more painful than the prospect of death itself. It was then that Alcestis, his wife, made a decision that would make her famous throughout Greece for centuries to come. She came to him quietly one evening as he lay weak and feverish in their bed. The room was dim, lit only by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. He had sighed. The sounds of the city were settling into the quiet rhythms of night. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "Don't," he whispered. "Please don't. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," she said gently. "I'm offering." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in the stories of Sisyphus's clever schemes. There was no trickery, no manipulation, no attempt to find loopholes or exploit technicalities. It was simply a woman who loved her husband explaining why she was willing to die so he could live. "Our children need a father," she said. "The kingdom needs a king. And I would rather have a shorter life filled with the knowledge that you're still in the world than a longer life knowing you're gone." Admetus tried to argue with her, to find alternatives, to convince her to reconsider, but Alcestis had made up her mind with the same quiet determination she brought to all her decisions. She wasn't acting from despair or impulse. She was making a carefully considered choice based on her understanding of love and duty. The actual exchange happened with surprising gentleness. Thanatos, the god of death, appeared in their chamber as he had in Sisyphus's palace. But this time there were no chains, no tricks, no attempts at bargaining. Alcestis simply stood up, kissed her husband goodbye, and walked away with death as naturally as if she were going to visit a neighbor. Admetus recovered immediately. Apollo's gift worked exactly as promised. The moment Alcestis died, his illness vanished, and his strength returned, but the victory felt nothing like triumph. He was alive, but at a cost that made life seem almost unbearable. The people of Pherae mourned Alcestis as they had never mourned anyone before. She hadn't died from accident or illness or old age. She had died from love, sacrificing herself for her family and kingdom. Her funeral became a celebration of the highest virtues humanity could achieve. But the story doesn't end there, because unlike Sisyphus's solitary struggle against cosmic forces, Alcestis's sacrifice touched the hearts of gods and mortals alike. Her selfless act created ripples that spread far beyond her own family. News of what she had done reached Heracles, the great hero, who was traveling through Pherae on his way to complete one of his legendary labors. When he arrived at Admetus's palace, he found his old friend in deep mourning, hosting guests with mechanical courtesy, while his heart was clearly broken. Heracles, who had faced monsters and gods and impossible challenges, was moved by the story of Alcestis's sacrifice. Here was someone who had defeated death not through strength or cleverness, but through pure love. It seemed wrong that such a victory should end in tragedy. So Heracles made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew only the story of Sisyphus. He decided to wrestle death itself and take back what death had claimed. The battle between Heracles and Thanatos took place in the shadows between life and death, in a realm where physical strength mattered less than strength of will. Heracles fought not for himself, not for glory or personal gain, but for the principle that love like Alcestis's should not go unrewarded. And somehow, impossibly, he won, not through trickery or technicalities, but through sheer determination fueled by moral conviction. Thanatos, faced with an opponent who fought purely for love rather than personal advantage, found himself unable to maintain his grip on Alcestis' soul. When Heracles returned Alcestis to life and to her husband's arms, it represented a different kind of victory over death than Sisyphus had achieved. Where Sisyphus had tried to avoid death through cleverness, Alcestis had accepted death through love, and love, as it turned out, was stronger than either cleverness or death itself. The reunion of Alcestis and Admetus became legendary throughout Greece, but not in the way you might expect. It wasn't celebrated as a triumph of heroic strength or divine intervention. Instead, it was remembered as proof that genuine self-sacrifice and love create their own form of power, a power that even death must respect. As evening settles over the palace of Pherae with Alcestis and Admetus watching their children play in the courtyard, you might reflect on how different this story is from Sisyphus's tale. Both involve mortals challenging death, but through completely opposite approaches. Sisyphus tried to cheat death through individual cleverness, seeing it as a problem to be solved through superior intelligence. Alcestis embraced death through love, seeing it as a sacrifice that could serve a greater good. One approach led to eternal punishment. The other led to resurrection and lasting happiness. What do you think this difference teaches us about the nature of death, love, and the choices we make when facing impossible situations? And which approach, clever self-preservation or loving self-sacrifice, do you think ultimately shows more wisdom about what it means to be human? After seeing how love conquered death in the story of Alcestis, let's explore another approach to the impossible. One that relies not on cleverness like Sisyphus or sacrifice like Alcestis, but on the pure power of art and music. Picture yourself in the hills of Thrace in northern Greece, where the most beautiful music in the world echoes across the valleys. The music comes from Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope, and the finest musician who has ever lived. When Orpheus plays his lyre and sings, wild animals gather peacefully to listen, trees uproot themselves to move closer to his music, famed stones weep at the beauty of his melodies. But tonight, the hills of Thrace are silent. Orpheus sits beside a grave, his lyre untouched in his lap, staring at the earth that covers his beloved wife, Eurydice. The silence is more profound than any music he's ever created, because it represents the absence of the one person whose voice he loved more than his own. Eurydice had died on their wedding day, not from illness or old age, but from a snake bite as she fled unwanted advances from another man. The tragedy was sudden, senseless, and complete. One moment she was laughing at their wedding feast, radiant with joy. The next she was gone, leaving Orpheus alone with his music and his grief. For days Orpheus has tried to sing. He'd raced to find some melody that could express what he's feeling, but every song turns into a lament so heartbreaking that even he cannot bear to continue it. The music that once brought joy to everyone who heard it now only amplifies his sorrow. As he sits in the darkness, Orpheus makes a decision that will either destroy him or achieve the impossible. He decides to do what no living person has ever done. He will travel to the underworld and ask Hades to return his wife to life. Unlike Sisyphus, who plotted and schemed to avoid his own death, Orpheus doesn't plan to trick anyone. Unlike Alcestis, he isn't prepared to die for love. His plan is simpler and perhaps more audacious than either approach. He will sing for the gods of the dead and hope that music can accomplish what force and cleverness cannot. The journey to the underworld begins at one of the entrances to the realm of the dead, a cave in the mountains, where shadows seem to lead deeper than any earthly cavern should go. Orpheus walks into this darkness, carrying only his lyre, following paths that living feet were never meant to tread. The first challenge he faces is Charon, the ferryman of the river Styx. Charon has simple rules. Only the dead may cross the river, and they must pay the proper fare. Orpheus is obviously alive, and he carries no coins for passage. Turn back, Charon tells him, his voice like the sound of water against stone. The living have no business in the realm of the dead. Instead of arguing or trying to bargain, Orpheus simply begins to sing. His song tells the story of love, not just his love for Eurydice, but love in all its forms, the love of mothers for children, the love of friends who stand by each other through hardship, the love of mortals for the beautiful world they're born into and must eventually leave. As he sings, something extraordinary happens. Charon, who has ferried souls across the Styx for countless centuries without emotion, finds tears running down his ancient cheeks. The song doesn't trick him or convince him to break the rules. It simply moves him so deeply that he cannot bring himself to refuse passage to the singer. Sing again when you return. Charon whispers as Orpheus steps onto his boat. I have forgotten what beauty sounds like. The same pattern repeats as Orpheus makes his way deeper into the underworld. Each guardian, each obstacle, each supernatural challenge is overcome not through force or trickery, but through the irresistible power of his music. Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards the gates of Hades, lies down and closes all 6 eyes as Orpheus sings a lullaby about the peace that comes after a long day's faithful service. The dog's 3 mouths, which have terrified countless souls, curve into something almost like smiles. The Furies, those terrible goddesses of vengeance who pursue the guilty, stop their eternal hunt to listen to a song about forgiveness and redemption. For the first time in their existence, they experience something other than anger. Even the tormented souls in the underworld find temporary relief from their punishments. Tantalus, forever reaching for fruit and water that retreat from his grasp, forgets his hunger and thirst while listening to Orpheus's melodies. Sisyphus, pushing his boulder up the mountain, pauses in his eternal labor, allowing the stone to rest while he absorbs the beauty of the music. Word of the living musician spreads quickly through the underworld. Souls gather along Orpheus's path, drawn by music that reminds them of everything beautiful they left behind in life. The realm of the dead has never heard anything like these songs. Finally, Orpheus reaches the throne room of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. This is the court that Sisyphus tricked with his bureaucratic cleverness. The same powers that Alcestis approached through willing sacrifice, but Orpheus approaches them through pure artistic expression. Standing before the two thrones, Orpheus begins his most important performance. He sings about Eurydice, not just about losing her, but about loving her. He sings about the way she laughed at his jokes, even the terrible ones, about how she hummed along when he played, never quite on key, but always with complete joy, about the way she looked at the world with curiosity and kindness. But more than that, he sings about love itself as a force in the universe, about how love creates beauty, inspires growth, and connects all living things. He sings about the tragedy of love cut short, and the waste of beauty destroyed before its time. As he sings, something unprecedented happens in the throne room of the dead. Persephone, the queen of the underworld, begins to cry. These aren't sadness, but tears of recognition. She remembers her own love story, her own separation from the world of growing things above. Even Hades, the stern god of the dead, who has seen every form of mortal suffering, finds himself moved. He has witnessed countless tragedies, but he has never heard them transformed into such beauty. The music doesn't deny the reality of death or try to argue it away. Instead, it shows how love can create meaning even in the face of loss. When the song ends, the throne room is silent for a long moment. Then Hades speaks, his voice gentler than it has been in eons. Orpheus, he says, your music has achieved something I would have thought impossible. You have brought beauty into the realm of death, and in doing so you have reminded us that death itself can be beautiful when it's part of a larger story of love. Persephone leans forward on her throne. We will return Eurydice to you, she says. Your love for her, expressed through your art, has proven stronger than death itself. Orpheus can hardly believe what he's hearing. Where Sisyphus's cleverness ultimately failed, and Alcestis's sacrifice required divine intervention to succeed, his music has accomplished the impossible through its own power. But then Hades raises his hand. There is one condition, he says, and suddenly Orpheus feels the weight of divine limitation settling on his triumph. Eurydice will follow you back to the world of the living, but you must not look back at her until you both have left our realm completely. If you turn to see her before you reach the surface, she will be lost to you forever. It's the kind of condition that makes perfect sense, and no sense at all. Why would the gods grant this miraculous gift only to hedge it with such a difficult restriction? But Orpheus doesn't argue. He's come too far and achieved too much to risk everything with questions. Now the journey back to the surface begins with joy and hope. Orpheus can hear Eurydice's footsteps behind him, can sense her presence following him up the dark paths toward life. They pass all the places where his music worked its magic on the way down. Cerberus still sleeping peacefully, the Furies still quiet, the tormented souls still resting from their labors. But as they climb higher, approaching the boundary between death and life, doubt begins to creep into Orpheus's mind. He can't hear Eurydice's breathing, can't hear her voice. What if the gods have tricked him? What if he's walking alone, believing he's been reunited with his wife, when actually she's still trapped below? The doubt grows stronger with each step. He finds himself straining to hear any sound that would confirm she's really there. A rustle of clothing, a sigh, even the sound of tears, anything that would prove he hasn't been deceived. Finally, just steps away from the surface. Just moments away from completing the impossible journey, Orpheus's nerve breaks. He turns around to look at Eurydice, needing to see with his own eyes that she's real, that his triumph is genuine, and there she is, beautiful, sad, fading, already. As the god's condition takes effect, she reaches out to touch his face one last time, her fingers passing through his skin like mist. "Why?" she whispers, and then she's gone, pulled back into the depths by forces stronger than love or music. Now Orpheus tries to follow her back down, but the paths that opened for him before are now closed. His music, which overcame every obstacle on his first journey, cannot open a second pathway to the dead. The gods have granted him one miracle, and his own doubt has destroyed it. He emerges into the sunlight alone, carrying with him the knowledge that he came closer than anyone to conquering death, and that his own human weakness snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. For the rest of his life, Orpheus wanders the world playing music that is more beautiful and more heartbreaking than anything heard before or since. His songs tell the story of his journey to the underworld, of love that almost conquered death, and of the human tendency to destroy our greatest victories through doubt and fear. But perhaps the real triumph of Orpheus isn't the temporary reunion with Eurydice, it's the music itself. His songs about love and loss continue to move people long after he's gone. In a way, his art achieves what his journey could not. It creates something beautiful and lasting from tragedy, something that touches other hearts and offers comfort to others facing their own losses. What do you think about Orpheus's failure at the very moment of success? Was it truly weakness that made him look back, or was it human nature asserting itself at the crucial moment? And what does his story tell us about the relationship between art, love, and our deepest human longings? Our journey through the various ways mortals have challenged death brings us finally to the most direct approach of all, simply overpowering death through sheer physical strength and determination. This is the method of Heracles, the greatest hero of ancient Greece, whose confrontation with Thanatos represents the ultimate test of mortal will against cosmic force. Picture yourself in the hills outside Philae, where we last saw Alcestis and Admetus living happily after her miraculous return from death. But we need to go back in time to the moment when Heracles first learned of Alcestis's sacrifice and decided that such love should not go unrewarded. Heracles arrives at the palace of Admetus in the late afternoon, dusty from travel and looking forward to the hospitality of an old friend. He's between labours here. Having just completed the capture of the Erymanthian boar and preparing for his next impossible task, these breaks between his legendary challenges are precious to him, times when he can almost feel like a normal person instead of a hero condemned to prove himself through endless trials. But when he reaches the palace, something feels wrong. The usual sounds of a prosperous court are muted. Servants move quietly, speaking in whispers. The atmosphere is heavy with grief. Though Heracles can't immediately identify what has happened, Admetus greets him at the door, and Heracles is shocked by his friend's appearance. The king looks like he's aged years in the month since they last met. His face is gaunt, his eyes red with weeping, and he moves like someone carrying an unbearable weight. "My friend," says Heracles, "what has happened here?" Admetus struggles to find words. How do you explain to someone that your wife died to save your life? How do you describe the particular kind of grief that comes from being alive at the cost of someone else's death? There has been a loss, Admetus finally manages. A terrible loss. But please, you are my guest. Let us speak of other things. True to the customs of Greek hospitality, Admetus tries to hide his grief and provide proper entertainment for his guest. A feast is prepared, wine is served, and musicians play, though their music sounds forced and joyless. Heracles, sensing his friend's pain but respecting his privacy, tries to lighten the mood with stories of his recent adventures. But eventually, the truth comes out. One of the palace servants, moved by Heracles' genuine concern, tells him the full story of Alcestis' sacrifice, how she willingly died to save her husband's life, how she walked away with death as calmly as if she were going to visit a neighbor, how the palace has been shrouded in mourning ever since. When Heracles learns what has happened, his reaction is immediate and intense. This is not just grief at the loss of a good woman, it's rage at the injustice of it all. When Ficline and Heman wave and hevend where a mostery a most sacrifice, loyalty, courage, that such a person should be claimed by death, while countless cruel and selfish people live long lives, strikes him as fundamentally wrong. Where is she buried? He asks. The servant. She's not, my lord. Death came for her personally. Her body simply faded away as she walked with him. There was nothing left to bury. This detail makes Heracles even angrier. Not only has death taken a good woman before her time, but he's denied her family even the comfort of proper funeral rites. It's an insult added to tragedy. Heracles makes a decision that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't spent years accomplishing impossible things. He decides to track down Thanatos and take back what death has stolen. Unlike Sisyphus, who relied on cleverness and tricks, or Orpheus, who used the power of music, Heracles plans to use his greatest strength, his physical power and his absolute refusal to accept defeat. He's going to wrestle death itself into submission. Finding Thanatos proves to be the first challenge. Death doesn't have a fixed address or maintain regular office hours. He appears wherever and whenever someone's time has come, then vanishes to attend to the next appointment on his endless schedule. But Heracles has learned through his many labors how to track things that don't want to be found. He follows the subtle signs that mark death's passage through the world. The places where flowers wilt for no apparent reason, where animals grow restless and birds stop singing. Death's presence leaves a kind of spiritual footprint that Heracles, with his enhanced senses, can detect. The trail leads him to a crossroads outside the city, a place where several paths meet beneath an ancient olive tree. This is one of the spots where death traditionally appears to mortals whose time has come. Neutral ground between life and death, between the mortal world and whatever lies beyond. As evening falls, Heracles waits beneath the olive tree. He doesn't have to wait long. As the last light fades from the sky, a figure emerges from the shadows, tall, cloaked, carrying the unmistakable presence of final authority. Thanatos, says Heracles, rising to his feet. Heracles, death replies, seeming unsurprised by the encounter. I've been expecting you. Then you know why I'm here. You want me to return Alcestis to life, but that's not how death works, hero. I don't give back what I've claimed. We'll see about that, says Heracles, and launches himself at the god of death. The battle that follows is unlike anything in mortal experience. It's not just a physical struggle, though Heracles uses all his legendary strength. It's a contest between the fundamental forces of life and death, played out through the conflict between two beings. Thanatos fights with the inexorable power of ending, of entropy, of the force that brings all things to their conclusion. His touch can drain strength, his presence can drain strength, his presence can inspire despair, and his very existence represents the futility of all mortal struggle. But Heracles fights with something equally powerful, the human refusal to accept the unacceptable. He represents not just physical strength, but the moral strength that drives people to challenge injustice, even when the odds are impossible. His power comes not from his muscles alone, but from his absolute conviction that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The struggle rages through the night. They grapple beneath the olive tree, their combat shaking the earth and causing the very air to shimmer with released energy. At times Thanatos seems to gain the upper hand, and Heracles can feel his strength ebbing away, his life force drawn toward the void that death represents. But each time he's on the verge of defeat, Heracles thinks about Alcestis, about her quiet courage, her willing sacrifice, her love for her family. He thinks about Admetus's grief and the injustice of good people suffering while the cosmic order remains indifferent to individual pain. These thoughts fuel him with a strength that goes beyond the physical. He's not just fighting for himself, not just trying to prove his own power. He's fighting for the principle that love and goodness should matter in the universe. However, that death shouldn't be allowed to claim the best people without a fight. As dawn approaches, Heracles gains the upper hand. His grip on Thanatos tightens, and for the first time in the god's eternal existence, Death finds himself overpowered by a mortal will. "Release her," Heracles demands. His hands locked around Thanatos' throat. "I cannot," gasps Death. "The rules." "Then we'll break the rules," says Heracles, applying more pressure. Some things are more important than rules, and in that moment something extraordinary happens. Thanatos, faced with a mortal whose conviction is stronger than cosmic law, makes a choice that surprises them both. He yields, not because he's physically defeated — gods cannot truly be destroyed by mortal strength — but because Heracles has demonstrated something that even death must respect: the power of absolute moral commitment. The hero's willingness to challenge the fundamental order of existence for the sake of love and justice. "Very well then," Thanatos says as Heracles releases him. "But understand, this is not a precedent. This is not a precedent. This is a one-time exception for a one-time situation. Alcestis' sacrifice was so pure, and your commitment to honoring it is so complete, that the normal order must bend to acknowledge extraordinary virtue." With a gesture that seems to cost him considerable effort, then Thanatos reaches into the folds of his cloak and withdraws a figure, Alcestis, pale and ethereal, but unmistakably alive. She looks around in confusion, as if waking from a dream. "How?" she begins. "Someone fought for you," Heracles explains gently. "Someone decided that your sacrifice deserved to be honored with an equal sacrifice." As the sun rises over the crossroads, Heracles escorts Alcestis back to Pherae, where her reunion with Admetus becomes the stuff of legend. But the real victory isn't just the return of one good woman to life. It's the demonstration that moral conviction backed by action can accomplish the impossible. The story of Heracles wrestling death spreads throughout Greece, but it's understood differently by different people. Some see it as proof that the greatest heroes can overcome any obstacle through sheer determination. Others interpret it as showing that the gods, despite their power, respect mortals who embody the highest virtues. But perhaps the most important lesson is subtler. Heracles didn't defeat death through superior power alone. He won because his cause was just and his commitment absolute. He fought not for personal gain, but for principle. He risked everything, not to save himself, but to honor someone else's sacrifice. This approach contrasts sharply with all the other methods we've seen mortals use to challenge death. Sisyphus relied on cleverness, but served only his own interests. Alcestis succeeded through sacrifice, but paid the ultimate price. Orpheus used the power of art, but was defeated by his own doubt. Heracles succeeded through moral strength, the conviction that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and the willingness to back that conviction with action. His victory wasn't just personal, it affirmed the value of virtue itself in a universe that often seems indifferent to individual worth. As our journey through these stories of mortals challenging death comes to an end, we've seen many different approaches: cleverness, sacrifice, artistry, and moral conviction. Each has its place, each has achieved remarkable things, and each has faced its own limitations. But perhaps the real lesson isn't about which approach is best. Perhaps it's about the human refusal to accept that anything is truly impossible. The drive to push against limitations even when failure seems certain, whether through Sisyphus's schemes, Alcestis' love, Orpheus's music, or Heracles' strength. Human beings continue to challenge the boundaries of existence itself, and intelligent in the end that it's crucial to accept limitations That insistence on dreaming of something better, something more, something beyond what seems possible, might be the most human characteristic of all. What do you think? Which of these approaches to challenging the impossible resonates most with you? And what limitations in your own life might benefit from a little mythological stubbornness? The refusal to accept that things must always be the way they are. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from succeeding against impossible odds, but from the courage to try despite those odds. After all, every human achievement began with someone willing to push against the boulder of impossibility, whether it rolled back down or not. Good night, friends. May your dreams be peaceful and your rest be deep. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, sweet dreams.